I will never forget the day my father got married again. Everyone was smiling, the music was playing, and the photographer was lining up people for family photos. I stood there, nervous but hopeful, thinking maybe this would be the start of something new. Maybe I would finally have a bigger family, but then it happened. My new stepmother looked right at me, and with a fake smile she leaned down and whispered, "Step aside. This is my real family now." The photographer hesitated, but she gave him a sharp look, and just like that I was pushed out of the picture. I remember standing there, watching as they posed without me, laughing as if I didn't even exist. And the worst part? My father said nothing. He stood there smiling for the camera, as if I wasn't even his child anymore. In that moment, I felt invisible. It was like my place in his life had been erased in a single click of the camera. And deep inside, I knew this was not just about one photo. This was the beginning of years of pain, years where I would be treated like I didn't belong in my own family. I had no idea back then how far my stepmother would go to push me out of my father's life. And I had no idea that one day, after everything, the truth would explode in a way none of us saw coming. Before I take you deeper into this story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the shocking twist that changed everything, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this one. After the wedding, things only got worse. At first, I tried to convince myself that maybe my stepmother just needed time to get used to me. Maybe one day she would accept me. But I was wrong. It started small. At dinner, she would pile food onto her children's plates, giving them the best pieces while I got the scraps. If there were desserts, her kids got 2 each, while I was handed none. When I looked hurt, she would laugh and say, "Don't be so sensitive. You're old enough not to need sweets." Her kids were treated like little kings and queens. My stepbrother got a brand new bike for his birthday. My stepsister got expensive clothes. But when my birthday came around, I was given a secondhand sweater that didn't even fit. She didn't even bother to wrap it. I looked at my father, hoping he would notice. But he only smiled weakly and said, "Be grateful. At least you got something." Those words cut deeper than the gift itself. At school, things weren't any better. My stepmother would pack fancy lunches for her children, sandwiches, fruit, even money for snacks. My lunchbox always had leftovers from the night before, usually cold rice or a piece of bread. I felt embarrassed opening it in front of my classmates. The worst part was how my father slowly began repeating her words. Whenever I tried to speak up, he would say, "Stop causing trouble. Your stepmother is trying her best. Why can't you be more like your stepbrother?" Those words broke me a little more each time. It was as if I was competing in my own house, and no matter how hard I tried, I was always the loser. I remember one night, everyone was sitting in the living room. My stepmother was bragging about her children's achievements. My stepsister had joined a dance class, and my stepbrother was doing well in sports. My father clapped proudly, telling them how talented they were. When I tried to speak about my grades, I had just gotten the highest marks in my class, my stepmother cut me off. She rolled her eyes and said, "Books won't make you a better person. You should learn to be more respectful instead." Everyone laughed. My father didn't even defend me. He just sat there nodding along. That night I cried in my room. I wasn't crying because they didn't give me gifts or praise. I cried because I felt invisible. I was his child too, but he treated me like I was a stranger in my own house. The next morning, I tried to brush it off, but the feeling stayed. Every small thing reminded me that I didn't belong. Even at family gatherings, my stepmother introduced her kids proudly while I was barely mentioned. Relatives started to notice and treated me as if I wasn't important either. Day by day, I was being erased, not just from photos, but from my father's life. And I knew. This was only the beginning. As the years passed, the pattern never changed. My stepmother's children grew up surrounded by love, gifts, and constant praise, while I was treated like an outsider. By the time I was a teenager, the difference between us became even more obvious. My stepbrother got the latest phone, while I carried around an old one with a cracked screen. My stepsister got a beautiful dress for prom, while I was told, "Don't waste money on silly things." I had to borrow a friend's old outfit just to attend. At school, people asked why my family never showed up to cheer for me during events. I never had an answer. The truth was, they never came. When I performed in a play, when I gave a speech, when I won awards, my seat in the audience was always empty. My stepmother said those events didn't matter, and my father never argued with her. The little boy inside me who once hoped for love was gone by then. I stopped expecting birthday gifts, stopped hoping for praise, and stopped waiting for anyone to clap for me. But even though I stopped expecting, the pain never really went away. One memory that still haunts me is from a summer evening. My stepbrother had just graduated, and my father threw a big party. The house was filled with relatives, friends, neighbors, everyone congratulating him. I stood in the corner, invisible, just like always. Later that night, I overheard one of the relatives whisper, "Why doesn't he care about his real child?" The words stung, but they also gave me a strange sense of comfort. At least someone else noticed. At least I wasn't crazy. But my father's silence was the loudest answer. As he got older, I watched him lean more and more on my stepmother. He trusted her with everything: money, decisions, even opinions about me. And she made sure I was always painted as the problem. If something went missing, it was my fault. If her kids misbehaved, she blamed me for being a bad influence. And every time, my father sided with her. By the time I reached adulthood, the damage was done. I had learned to keep my head down, to live quietly in the background. But deep inside, I was carrying wounds no one could see. Wounds that came not from my stepmother's cruelty, but from my father's choice to ignore me. The years rolled by. My stepbrother went to college with full support from the family. My stepsister got help starting her own business. I worked part-time jobs just to keep myself afloat, saving every coin I could. I often wondered if my father noticed the difference. Did he not see how unevenly he treated us? Or did he simply not care? One day I decided to ask him. We were sitting in the living room. He looked tired, older than before, but still sharp in his words. "Father," I said softly, "do you ever wonder how I feel when you praise them but never me?" He frowned. "Why are you always jealous? They're your siblings. You should be happy for them," I wanted to scream. But instead I whispered, "I'm not jealous. I just wish you saw me too." His answer? Silence. He turned away, and that was the end of the conversation. That silence stayed with me for years. It was during this long, painful time that I made a promise to myself. I would survive. I would work hard, I would keep moving forward, and one day, I would build a life where I wasn't invisible anymore. But what I didn't know then was that life had its own plans. The years of neglect were only setting the stage for something bigger, something I never expected. Because as my father grew older and weaker, the cracks in his perfect little world began to show. And soon, the truth would finally come out. Time has a way of changing people, even the strongest ones. My father, who once stood tall and proud, began to slow down. His hair turned white, his back curved, and he spent more and more time in bed. Age had finally caught up with him. At first, my stepmother seemed caring. She fussed over him, making sure he had his medicine, cooking his meals, sitting by his side. To anyone looking in from the outside, she appeared to be the perfect wife. But I had lived long enough in that house to know better. Her kindness had limits. Whenever he complained too much, she snapped at him. Whenever he asked for something small, like a blanket or tea, she rolled her eyes and muttered under her breath. Her children didn't care much either. They were too busy with their own lives, only visiting when they needed money. And me? Even though I had every reason to walk away after years of neglect, I couldn't. No matter what, he was still my father. So I stayed. I cooked, I cleaned, I helped him walk to the garden, and I sat with him when he felt lonely. For a long time, he didn't say much. But sometimes I caught him staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, almost like he was searching for something he had lost. The spark event came one stormy evening. The rain poured down heavily and the roof leaked in spots. My father, weak and coughing, asked my stepmother if she could bring him his medicine. She was busy on the phone with one of her friends, gossiping and laughing. "I'll get it later," she said, waving her hand. He begged her softly, but she snapped. "Stop being dramatic. You can wait." I was in the kitchen and overheard everything. I rushed to his side with the medicine and a glass of water. He took it gratefully, his hand trembling as he held mine. That's when it happened. He looked at me with tired eyes and whispered, "Why is it always you?" "And never them?" I didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, he wasn't defending her. He wasn't ignoring me. He was finally seeing. Later that night, he overheard something he wasn't meant to. My stepmother was on the phone again, this time with her sister. She laughed and said, "He won't last much longer. Once he's gone, the house and money will all be mine. My children will live comfortably. That other one, he'll be left with nothing." She didn't know he was awake. She didn't know he heard every word. The next morning, his face was pale but serious. He called me into his room. For the first time in my life, he asked me to sit beside him, not as a child he ignored, but as someone who mattered. "I've been blind," he said slowly. "All these years, I let her control everything. I thought keeping peace in the house was more important than listening to you. But I see now. She doesn't care for me, not the way you do." Tears filled my eyes. I wanted to forgive him right there, but the hurt of all those years was heavy. I stayed quiet. He continued, his voice shaky. "I need to make things right before it's too late." At that moment, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just guilt talking. But what I didn't know was that he had already made up his mind. Behind the closed doors of his lawyer's office, he quietly changed his will. He left everything, not to the stepmother or her children, but to me, the child who had been erased from the family photo all those years ago, and he did it without telling a soul. Not even me. It was his last secret. Not long after that stormy night, my father's health began to decline faster. His steps grew weaker, his voice softer. The strong man who once stood at the center of every room was now lying in bed, needing help for almost everything. The house felt heavier than ever. My stepmother tried to act sweet whenever visitors came, but I could see her patience wearing thin. To her, my father was no longer the proud husband she could show off. He was a burden. One evening, the truth finally broke through. My father had asked all of us to gather in the living room, me, my stepmother, and her 2 children. His voice was rough, but his eyes were sharp. "I need to talk to my family," he said. We sat down. My stepmother plastered on her usual fake smile, her children smirking beside her. I stayed quiet, unsure of what was coming. He looked straight at me first. "You've been by my side every day. You've cared for me when I could give you nothing in return." I was blind for too many years, but I see it now. My stepmother's smile twitched. "Darling, what are you talking about?" "We've all cared for you." His voice grew stronger. "No, you cared for my money. You cared for appearances. But when I needed love, you gave me nothing. And when my child needed a father, I failed." The room fell silent. My stepbrother shifted uncomfortably. My stepsister looked away. My stepmother's face turned red. "How dare you accuse me after everything I've done? I gave this house life. I raised these children." He coughed, his breathing heavy, but his words cut through the air like a knife. "You raised them with lies. You poisoned this family, and I let you." Then he turned to me again, his eyes softened. "I don't have much time left, but I need you to know this. You are my child. My only regret is not showing you sooner." For the first time in my life, he held my hand. His grip was weak, but it carried years of unspoken words. Tears burned my eyes, but before I could answer, my stepmother exploded. "This is nonsense," she shouted. "You don't know what you're saying. You're sick. You don't mean any of this." But deep down, we all knew he did. The room was tense, her words bouncing off the walls, but he didn't argue. He simply leaned back against his pillow, exhausted but strangely peaceful. In that moment, I realized something. He wasn't just speaking for me. He was leaving behind a truth they couldn't erase, no matter how much they tried. I left the room that night with my heart heavy, but also with a small spark of hope. For once he had seen me. For once I wasn't invisible. What I didn't know then was that this conversation was only the beginning. The real storm was yet to come, because while my father spoke his truth, the will he had quietly changed was still a secret. And when that secret came out, it would shatter everything. Not long after that night, my father's strength gave out. One morning, I walked into his room with breakfast and found him lying still, his eyes closed, his face calm. He was gone. I stood there frozen. For years, I thought I would feel anger or bitterness when this moment came, but instead I felt empty. Empty, but also strangely at peace. At least in his final days, he had spoken the truth. At least for a brief moment I had been seen. The house, however, turned into chaos almost instantly. My stepmother cried loudly, throwing herself into the role of the grieving widow. Her children comforted her, but I knew their tears were not just for him. They were thinking about the money, the house, the inheritance. I stayed quiet, mourning in silence. A week later, we gathered at the lawyer's office for the will reading. The room was tense, the air thick with expectation. My stepmother sat proudly in the front, her children on either side. I sat in the back, unsure if I even wanted to hear what was coming. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. At first, it was the usual formal language, I, being of sound mind, and so on. My stepmother leaned forward, already smiling, already ready to claim her prize. But then the words changed. To my beloved child. Her smile froze. The lawyer continued, his voice steady. I leave the house, the savings, and all remaining assets to my firstborn. The one who has stood by me in loyalty and care when others did not. To the child who showed love when I was blind to it. Everything I own shall go to them. He paused and looked up at me. To you, the room erupted. My stepmother jumped to her feet, her face twisted with rage. This is a lie. He would never do this. He promised everything to me and my children. Her son slammed his fist on the table. Her daughter began crying, shouting that it wasn't fair, but the lawyer only shook his head. The documents are clear. Your husband changed his will shortly before his passing. He signed it himself, in my presence. Everything is legally binding. I sat there in shock. My heart pounded in my chest. I had no idea. I never asked for this. For years I lived thinking I was forgotten, erased, and now I was the only one left standing. My stepmother turned on me, her eyes filled with venom. This is your doing. You poisoned him against us. Her words hit me hard, but I stood up slowly. My voice shook, but I forced myself to speak. I didn't ask for this. I didn't even know. All I ever wanted was to be seen as his child. That's all? She scoffed, her face red with fury. You'll regret this. You don't deserve a thing, the lawyer interrupted firmly. Enough. The will is final. The rest of the meeting was a blur. Papers were signed, copies handed out. My stepmother stormed out, her children trailing behind her, shouting and cursing. Their cries echoed in the hallway, a chorus of anger and disbelief. I stayed behind for a moment, sitting quietly as the weight of it all sank in. For years I had been invisible. For years I had been pushed aside, erased from family photos, ignored at the dinner table, treated like I didn't matter. But in the end, I was the only one my father chose. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about the money. It was about finally being recognized, finally being given the place I had deserved all along. As I walked out of that office, I felt lighter. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined me. My stepmother once told me I wasn't part of the family. She erased me from the pictures. But now, she was the one erased from the future, and that was a truth she could never rewrite. Life has a strange way of teaching us lessons. Sometimes the lessons are soft and gentle, and sometimes they are sharp and cruel. For me, the biggest lesson came after years of being ignored, rejected and erased by the very people who should have loved me the most. When I walked out of that lawyer's office, I didn't feel like I had won. There were no fireworks, no victory dance, no satisfaction in seeing my stepmother and her children storm out in anger. All I felt was quiet. A deep, heavy quiet that filled my chest. I had spent so many years longing for something simple, my father's love, his approval, even just a smile of pride. And though he had failed me for most of his life, in his last days, he finally saw me. That truth mattered more than any house or bank account ever could. But let me be honest, it didn't erase the pain. Childhood scars don't disappear overnight. I still remembered the birthdays where no one clapped for me, the dinners where my plate was empty, the nights I cried alone because I felt invisible. Those memories lived inside me, and no inheritance could wash them away. And yet, there was something healing in the way things ended. My father, who had once ignored me, made a final choice that proved he regretted it. His silence during my childhood had crushed me, but his final decision gave me a voice again. It also showed me something important. People can be blind for a long time, but truth has a way of breaking through, sometimes at the very end. My stepmother once thought she had erased me completely. She had my father's ear, the attention of the relatives, and control over the house. She believed her children would inherit everything while I would be left with nothing. She thought she had won, but in the end, all her schemes, all her cruelty, all her years of pretending, crumbled. She was left with nothing but anger. And I was left with the truth. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about my existence finally being acknowledged. It was about the child who once stood outside a family photo, unwanted and forgotten, finally becoming the center of the story. Sometimes, I still look at that old wedding picture where I was pushed out. I remember the sting of being told, "This is my real family now." Back then, I believed her. I believed that I didn't belong. But today, when I look at it, I see something different. I see a lie frozen in time, because in the end, I was the only one my father trusted. I was the only one who stood by him when the world grew dark. And no photo, no cruel words, no fake smiles could change that. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I want you to hear this. Your worth isn't decided by how others treat you. Your value isn't erased just because someone refuses to see it. Sometimes the people who ignore you will never admit their mistake. But sometimes, like in my case, the truth will reveal itself in unexpected ways. And when it does, it's not about revenge. It's about healing. It's about knowing that despite everything, you mattered. For years, I thought I was nothing more than a shadow in my father's house. But now I know I was always his child. I was always the one who cared. And in the end, he finally saw that too. So maybe this story isn't about betrayal after all. Maybe it's about redemption. A painful, late redemption, but one that mattered more than anything else. Because even if love comes late, even if recognition comes at the very end, it still has the power to heal wounds that once felt impossible to close. And if this story touched you, if you've ever felt unseen or erased in your own life, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join this channel. We share stories that remind us we're not alone in our struggles, and that even in betrayal, there can be truth, justice, and sometimes even a little redemption.